Ni hao, tēnā koutou katoa, which is the New Zealand greeting, from where I used to come from, and Yakulun, which is the greeting from Tasmania in Australia, where I now teach since 2016. So I've been in Australia for 8 years. Our presentation is going to focus very much on the mathematics side. So Merrilyn and Emily and I are all mathematics teachers or mathematics educators, and we have a particular interest in the math side. So as Linda introduced, there's 4 components: English, geography, STEM, mathematics, and we are very much the mathematics side of the team. My personal background, I was a high school teacher and head of department in a big secondary school in New Zealand back in 1993. I had 26 teachers in my department. At my mathematics meetings, weekly meetings, I would have 12 teachers come along. The remaining 14 teachers were out of field. They were science, maybe not so out of field as science teacher, but some were physical education teachers. They had to go their own. We only had team meetings once a week. They had to go to their main meeting. They couldn't come to maths. And that's what when we talk about the culture, my experience there, the culture, my principal would say to me, oh, you need to take these people to fill up their teaching units. We don't have enough maths teachers. You take these people. So as a head of the department, the culture was anyone could teach mathematics. And Emily's going to talk more about that. So I'm really just introducing today. Merrilyn's again been involved for a long time out of field teaching and had a role in Ireland where she was leading projects and that. So she's going to talk about that side, and then Emily is going to come in and talk about the model from a mathematics perspective. She's going to go into 2 aspects of the mathematics. We're going to break down particular mathematics, specifically in Australia, but also in the broader international sense. And then we're going to finish with some next steps. And we welcome some input from the people here about what those next steps might be. What do we do next? Linda's talked about this, about Australia being a hotspot, and Julie mentioned this as well. One thing, Australia's got a particular problem, but New Zealand was the same, as I've said, and I think internationally there's a shortage of teachers and a shortage of maths and science teachers. So that's what we're focusing on. And I think at this point, that's my introduction. I'm going to hand over to Merrilyn, who hopefully has power back in Australia, because she was getting power business we fix her out. So are you there, Merrilyn?
Yes, I am, Greg. The power's back on. Thank goodness I'm not running off batteries. Good morning, everyone. It's been fascinating listening to all of you. So we're talking specifically about out-of-field maths teaching in Australia, and this has been a concern in Australia for decades. Mathematics is a core subject in the school curriculum, and most students take a mathematics subject of some kind right until the end of secondary school. That means it's a high enrolment subject, and we just don't have enough qualified teachers. And of course, as you've heard, there's a major teacher workforce crisis in Australia that has not happened overnight, and that's making the whole out-of-field maths teaching situation much worse. But the mathematics community and the mathematics education community have been advocating for action to address out-of-field teaching in our discipline for many years. Our most recent efforts have highlighted, as Linda referred to, the complete lack of comprehensive national data on what subjects secondary school teachers are qualified to teach. So no one knows how many qualified secondary maths teachers there are in Australia. We've also had a look at quite a large number of programs that universities are offering to upskill out-of-field teachers of maths. The problem there, though, is that there is huge discrepancies and lack of consistency in those programs, which actually speaks to the challenge of defining what does it mean to be out of field and what kind of pathways count towards becoming in-field. So if I can have the next slide, please, Linda. All right, can we go to the next one?
Next slide.
Yeah, that's it.
There we go.
Fantastic. As you've heard, Linda started to talk about the many complexities of thinking about what out-of-field teaching means. So Linda and her colleagues have developed different ways of describing out-of-fieldness. In other words, there are different ways of explaining what it means to be out of field. So I suppose the common way is to say, well, we think about what qualifications a teacher might have for teaching a specific subject. But a teacher can be more or less out of field in mathematics, for example, depending on how many maths classes they're asked to teach each year. And that can vary from year to year. So the feeling of being out of field can change. There are other ways, though, in which being out of field is not necessarily a permanent or static state of affairs, because many teachers can develop an affinity with and confidence in and capability in the subject that they're teaching with experience and over time. And of course, a school's culture of support or lack of support can also affect the way that a teacher feels about their degree of out of fieldness. Can we go to the next slide now? Thanks, Linda. So what we want to do for the whole project is to map this landscape of out-of-field teaching, and we're just going to talk about that landscape in mathematics. So the kind of things that we need to think about, and Emily is going to talk about, is the kinds of professional education that are offered to out-of-field maths teachers and what sort of structures and requirements are implicated there. How do people talk about out-of-field teaching of maths? For example, is it all about the teacher shortfall? Is it about a problem of teaching quality? How is entry to the teaching profession regulated and accredited? Linda's mentioned some of that. And what do teachers need to do in order to retain their professional registration? There are some interesting things going on there. How do teachers actually gain a subject specialisation? Is it only through initial teacher education? Can it be done through taking other courses? Can it be done through learning on the job? But we also need to understand factors that operate at other levels. School priorities, education system policies and features, and also the role of non-school stakeholders. And we've heard a little bit about teacher associations, but there are many others as well. So if we go to the next slide, thanks. So current approaches, as I said before, mathematics seems to have grappled with the phenomenon of out-of-field teaching perhaps for longer than other disciplines. But there are some very interesting contradictory myths in the maths space. On the one hand, many school principals seem to believe that anyone can teach mathematics, because every qualified teacher or every school teacher, no matter what their subject specialisation, has learned mathematics in secondary school. Therefore, it's assumed that they should be able to teach maths. But this contrasts with another pervasive and damaging myth, the myth that not everyone can learn mathematics, because many people believe that mathematical ability is something that you are either born with or not. So how is it possible to have these two interesting myths and beliefs operating at the same time? But if we turn to the question of professional education for out-of-field teachers of mathematics, there are many programs being offered, and they differ in a couple of important dimensions. Firstly, they differ in terms of how far or how much are they trying to upgrade the out-of-field teacher's knowledge? Just a little bit or by a whole lot? And secondly, with what relative emphasis on two important kinds of knowledge of the mathematics content at a level far beyond the level that's being taught, versus knowledge of mathematics pedagogy, and they're both important. So we can imagine, for example, what a full upgrade might look like, which would give out-of-field teachers the same qualifications as someone who was qualified as a maths specialist through their initial teacher education degree. And that in Australia includes having a major in university level mathematics. But it's more common to see what I would call partial upgrades being offered in the form of graduate certificates or graduate diplomas, which do provide significant boosting to out-of-field teachers' pedagogical content knowledge of mathematics, and sometimes, but not always, to their higher level subject matter knowledge of maths. And there are also quite a lot of other options, probably less demanding, for example, micro-credentials, which might eventually count as credit towards a formal qualification. And there are quite a lot of professional development workshops, webinars and so on in mathematics for out-of-field teachers that are currently being offered by the national and state maths teacher associations. So that's just a bit of an overview of the current state for mathematics. And I think I'm handing over to Emily now, who's going to show you some of our initial analysis.
Thank you, Merrilyn. If I could have the next slide, please, Greg. Thank you. Linda has already introduced you to the Bronfenbrenner ecological systems theory that we've used as the underpinning framework for what we've looked at as we've started to analyse policy documents, the information that is available now in order to map our current state. And that's really what we're going to present in this session is looking at, as we've analysed these documents, as we've analysed what's available to teachers in terms of professional education, as we've looked across different support networks that are available to teachers, like professional associations or unions or other aspects, what are we seeing in terms of the factors that we see influence, particularly in mathematics? If we pop across to the next slide, please, Greg. Oh, we'll just build up that framework again for a second. And we'll look across each of those aspects as we look to the factors. Thanks, Greg.
One more.
One more. It's almost there. It's right there. It is. As we started to map those factors, and certainly the work that Linda and Chris and others have been doing, taking that more high-level look across each of the learning areas and across each of the subjects, we start to see where our analytical framework is developing from across the systems and across those influences. So for us in this presentation, we're going to use the blue box at the bottom that looks a bit like a trapezium, that looks to the subject specialisation as the lens for which we're looking at this three particular aspects that influence the nature of what we see right now in terms of the culture for mathematics in the current state. Next slide, please, Greg. So when I'm going to present across, and you saw this image before that Linda gave us, which is that current picture of the ecosystem. And you can see some of the boxes are a little different coloured. And I'm going to pick a couple from each of the areas, just as examples in the interest of time, to give you an indication of the sorts of things we're finding as factors that are particularly influencing for mathematics and the ecosystem that is for that mathematics lens. Both Greg and Merrilyn, in introducing to this point, have talked about that contradictory position that we see. Greg talked about it from his experience as a head of department, where the feeling from the school executive is that anyone can teach mathematics. Merrilyn brought that back in when she talked about the sorts of things that we see as anyone can teach maths, but there's a contradiction in another myth that not everyone can learn maths. And what we see is that certainly leads to an interesting position for our teachers. For teachers for principals who feel this, that anyone can teach maths, they don't see the issue of out-of-field teaching. Because in this particular myth, means that if anyone can teach maths, no one is technically out of field. And that's one of the factors we see influence the decision-making processes that sit across workplaces, professional education for teachers who are currently teaching mathematics out of field. If we move and start to look more deeply into professional education on the next slide, where that plays out particularly is if we look to how teachers engage in professional education. And Linda talked about this a little bit earlier as well. There is a feel in a number of schools within Australia, and certainly I speak, being a person who is seated in Queensland, I can talk particularly from a Queensland perspective often, that for teachers to access professional education, it needs to be specified in their annual improvement plan for them. So each teacher talks about the sorts of goals they're working towards for themselves across a year. And for a lot of teachers, that has to sit within the things that they're developing in themselves. Oftentimes, that's sitting in their in-field area as opposed to their out-of-field area. And because of this, it means that oftentimes principals and others in the executive leadership will not support teachers to go and access some of the professional education that would actually support them in their out-of-field teaching space, because they don't see it as an important area for teachers to develop in themselves. Of course, that has implications that sits across in the workplace. If you wouldn't mind popping to the next slide, where we see that capability issue raising. If teachers aren't able to access the professional development or the professional education, they have the capability issue that they're feeling is never able to be resolved. They're learning on the job. They're learning from the people that are around them, and there's some wonderful, I'm sure, supports there for them. But that can sometimes not just reinforce what some of the best practice, sometimes it can reinforce the practices that we perhaps don't support or don't build capability. Talking about one of the issues that Greg raised earlier as well, we see that as teachers may not have access to come along to their staff meetings that sit with, say, mathematics, they're not getting the professional conversations as well that are helping to develop their understandings. So that capability issue is just continually reinforced. Those sorts of meetings, those sorts of professional conversations give opportunity for developing assessment or for moderating assessment, building that capability that sits. So that capability is never resolved. That capability issue is never resolved. From an initial teacher education perspective, which was Julianne brought up before, actually, when she was when she asked a question in the last section. One of the things that we are certainly noticing, that with lower numbers of students choosing advanced level mathematics in senior secondary school, and Greg will, I'm sure, report that in Tasmania that's at an all-time low at the moment, as it is in a number of states across Australia. This flow-on effect occurs that is hurting the pipeline of teachers that are coming through to teach mathematics from the outset. So we see lower levels in universities of students choosing advanced level mathematics. And of course, those that are choosing to become teachers studying high advanced level mathematics is a small subset of that group. A lot of them see the pull and lure of jobs in other areas, in other industries, and we see that as an issue that's impacting the number of teachers coming through, that those that are studying mathematics have a multitude of options at university level for career pathways. But the small subset who are choosing to go on into education is getting smaller. And that means that we are seeing a very much smaller lower numbers who are motivated and suitably qualified to become mathematics teachers coming through from the very start. I believe that leads me to hand back over to Greg.
Thank you, Merrilyn. Yes, and that's the last prepared slide. I might also say that in my introduction, I forgot to say how excited and almost surreal it seems to be here in Shanghai, and I'm so grateful to Linda and Bo for setting this up and for being here. It's wonderful being such an international group, so I've got to say that at the start. And also how exciting it is to be working with Merrilyn and Ning on this, because as Merrilyn said, we've known each other for a long time in Virga, the Mathematics Education Research Group of Australasia, and it's wonderful to be working on a project that is so timely. I mean, as Julie said, it's been brought to the fore by the teacher crisis, but it's been there for decades. So now we can finally, there's an impetus to talk. So one of the things we're going to be doing is talking to teachers, talking to policymakers, talking to a whole range of people in this field. And so we're interested now in where we go next. We've done the literature review. We're in the process of organising some interviews. We presented at last year's Mooga conference to mathematics education educators and got some suggestions from them. So open to suggestions and directions from the floor.